All right. So here's what we're going to do today. Today is going to be a little different. I'm pre-recording this so that I can just read the article. When I air it, I will be in the chat. So it is both live and pre-recorded. But I found this essay as I was just kind of banging around, and I read it, and then I gave it to a friend. She read it. She seemed to think it made sense. So I'm going to read it because I think a lot of people, we find ourselves getting into these arguments with people. They're like, what's the value of Bitcoin? What's the value of cryptocurrencies? I don't get it. It doesn't fit my discounted cash flow model. And that's just I think a flawed way to look at all this stuff. It's just, in my opinion, it is the wrong way. It's all fake news. It's phony stuff. Yeah. It didn't happen. Bad. So we don't want to be on that path. So what we're going to do, I'm going to read this in, and I want you guys to just kind of sit back and coast. Just coast. But anyway, it's a really cool article, essay, not too long. It was by Dr. North, Gary North, who was an economist, historian. And when this was first published by FEE, F-E-E, which is the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE. Funny that it's fee, because like you pay a fee, right? It was in 1969. So this is Sunday, June 1st, 1969. He wrote this. He was a member of the Economists, the magazine, National Committee on Monetary Policy. He was teaching at the University of California, Riverside. And so I think it's important enough that I want to read through it. I'm not going to try to nuance it or anything like that. I'm just going to read it, but I think it's worth it. So this is an easy day. So everybody, Monday, first day of the week, woo woo. Well, depends on where you work. Sometimes there is no end of the week or beginning of the week. It's just, it goes. It just continues to go. So anyway, I'm going to read it in. Just relax. So after these non-commercial break, we'll be right back. So hopefully, and I will be watching how many likes does this video get to see if I have to nuke it or not. Oh, I'll be watching. More. I'm always at a loss trying to figure out what's going to be the good background music. But I think for this one, maybe Feeding Ducks. Info. That's too upbeat. Well, this isn't downbeat, but that's not right. Lo-fi. I don't know, man. Acoustic? No, that's creepy. It's like you're going on some kind of weird journey. We're going on a weird journey. Nope. Let's try this one. That's not terrible. Yeah, that's not terrible. Okay, let me chop that one down to about a 22. All right, cool. So we're gonna start with a kind of a presupposition, and this is I had thrown this on Twitter, but anybody in the crypto space, you guys are gonna get these D-bags that it's impossible for them to model because they have to model everything. They can't model. They don't have 5 T's. It's not enough for them to look at the team, the token, the timing, the tokenomics, technology, ask why the token exists. They can't even get to the idea that a token needs to be, that like there's any value in anything crypto. They're okay with a centralized system, I guess. Or they say, yeah, there's problems, but those problems, it's just inherent in humanity. And there's no fixing it. And that's kind of a very cognitively weak, just intellectually weak argument. And they say, well, if I can't model it, I can't buy it. Well, if you can't invest in something because you see the future, you shouldn't be buying it. Also, though, you don't get to look back and S-talk it because you missed it by 13 years. So If people value something, it has value, period. That's otherwise people wouldn't pay for it. It has some value to someone, right? If people do not value something, it does not have value. It sits like on the side of the ocean and just gathers up. And then some people might gather it and throw it away. Then the only value would be like a weird negative value where the value is it employs people to pick it up. And that's certainly not a direct value. Anyway, that's not intrinsic value. So intrinsic value arguments are silly, right? There is no intrinsic, right? Because value becomes, well, what equals happiness? Well, that gets into a really subjective kind of discussion about what equals happiness for you or that guy over there, that woman over there, that pronoun undisclosed. Like, so that becomes a very nebulous, again, cognitively weak way to discuss things. So don't get caught up in all that. Don't find yourself stuck in some argument with people that, one, they probably missed it. If they didn't miss it, they don't get it. There's no point arguing, right? So don't. And don't fall into this trap where people will pull some weird, random, very nebulous fact and say, do you know this? And they'll use that because they're basically, it's this kind of injury by intelligence. They're intelligent enough to, either make ad hominem arguments where they'll attack the person that came up with the information, but not the information, or they'll attack by using a specific interpretation of the information, which is not the information. Like somebody can produce the data and they'll say, well, one interpretation of the data. No, the data is the data. Now you can look at the data and say, okay, I derive using science X, Y, and Z from the empirical data, numbers, information that is received via testing and polling, whatever information collection system you have. So just understand that there's all sorts of ways to make perverse arguments, but you don't want to win or lose an argument. That's not the whole point. The whole point is to have thoughtful discussion with other people and to constantly wonder to yourself, am I assuming the wrong things at the base of my thinking? Well, this is just a great, this was in 1969, this guy Gary wrote this. This is just a great kind of way to frame your own thinking, not so much about any specific thing having to do with crypto or any specific argument or platform. This is not that. This is, again, building your ability to recognize your own strengths and weaknesses, your cognitive biases, think, critically, make continually, hopefully better critical decisions, endeavor to be better at decision-making, endeavor to be better at making, coming up with your version of what you think the future might look like. So you have to have a strong foundation. I think you should be game theoretical. I think you should be a critical thinker. And I think you should think about the act of thinking. If you think about thinking, master the basics, be brilliant at the basics of thinking. Most people, they don't even have time to think about anything. Oh, the football game's coming on, so grab a beer, got to work tomorrow. Man, that's you're never going to get anywhere that way. Then you're just waiting to get lucky. Most people's strategy is get lucky. What are you going to do today? I'm going to wake up and get lucky. No, that's not a strategy. Getting lucky is not a strategy. And so that's not what we want to do. So anyway, I'll do I don't know if I should do little box today when I read. Ooh, I could be a little box. I could be right there on the edge. Hey, I could be there, or I could push it over. This is less about me. I'm going to go down. I'm going down. So when we do this, just understand that there's not right or wrong, and you're never going to argue with someone and they go halfway through the argument, oh, you know what? You're right, Steve. You're absolutely right. I've been looking at this all wrong my whole life. And it took me getting in this verbal confrontation with you, usually in front of other people. Relatives are the worst. They'll try to pull this garbage at the dinner. Oh, about that crypto stuff, I guess that's over. Oh, yeah, it's probably over, Steve. It's all over. It's done. It's done because of a few months down. Never mind that Bitcoin is the most appreciating asset in all of human history. But you're right, Steve. It's probably over. It's probably over with. This thing's done. The experiment known as disintermediation, it just didn't make it. You know what? They were building a 300-story building. They got to the 299th floor. They just decided to call it quits. They're gonna pack their stuff up and just mosey on home. Just mosey on over yonder and try something else. No, Steve, dummy. But no one in the middle of an argument says you were right, Because then what happens is their ego gets in the way and all this kind of, So you can't put someone else in a position like that. If you want to give someone else something, some kind of, cognitive food, something to chew on, then you need to present your arguments. First of all, try to structure it as a dialogue rather than an argument, and just let people know that you don't care. You got to be nice about this, but you have to tell them, I don't care if you believe it, don't believe it. I'm just going to tell you why I do, right? This is why I believe XYZ. I've already made decisions, or I'm going to be making decisions based on my belief in XYZ. I don't care if you believe it or not. It's not my job for you to care about anything. I'm just telling you why I do. This is what humans do. We trade ideas. Hopefully we evolve from them, but mostly not. Anyway, so I'm going to read this thing in. Let me get the correct banner here. Yeah. Oh yeah, it's already on there. What? Okay. So with that basic presupposition, that's too big. I don't know. I wish there was like a medium-sized box. I guess that's a good one. That one, do we do this one? Ooh, that one's cool, but it's too low. I feel like I'm on the bottom of the screen. I feel like I'm eating those words. I don't want to eat those words. That's not my idea. All right. So let's go into it. The fallacy of intrinsic value. Ideas die hard, says an old proverb. Even in an age of rapid change, such as our own, the slogans, cliches, and errors of earlier times seem to persist. It often seems like the truth that once brought peace, stability, and steady progress, those are the things first to be abandoned, while the errors persist undaunted. Henry Hazlitt, we all love Henry Hazlitt, right? Henry Hazlitt, Economics in One Lesson, which you can find on YouTube. Henry Hazlitt, he once wrote of John Maynard Keynes that the true things Keynes said were not new, and the new things that he said were not true. Yet it is this new aspect of Keynes' new economics that has fascinated today's guild of economists. So remember, we're talking 1969. The triumph of the slogan is understandable. We are limited creatures. We cannot attain exhaustive knowledge of anything, and certainly not of everything. As a result, we find ourselves at the mercy of the expert. Simultaneously, we live in our lives, I would say, are much more complicated than when this was written 54 years ago, right? But we live our lives day to day in terms of ideas that we cannot continually be re-examining, right? We have these heuristic models. Some things must be accepted on faith or by experience. We have neither the time nor the capacity to rethink everything we know. Still, no intelligent person dares to neglect the possibility that his opinion in some area or another may be open to question. This is the thing that people miss. I'm going to read that one again because that's probably, if you were to distill the basic problem between humans, especially financial issues, it is probably this. Some things must be accepted on faith or experience, but we have neither the time nor the capacity to rethink everything we know. Still, no intelligent person dares to neglect the possibility that his opinion in some area or another may be open to question. At times, it is vital that we reconsider a subject, especially if it's a barrier to clear thinking or effective action. If our error is in a realm of life which we claim to be experts, or at least skilled amateurs, then the necessity of careful reasoning is exceptionally important. The key there being careful reasoning, right? The persistence of some erroneous line of reasoning here, simply because this unexamined train of thought is familiar, can be disastrous. So think about that. Sometimes you go in the back of your mind, you're like, I don't even want to entertain any other ideas because then I'd have to rework all of these theories. But in finance, if you want to be right, you want to be wrong as quick as possible. You know, this, what is the saying in chess? The person that makes the second to last mistake is the winner. You want to make mistakes first, quickly, fast, so that you can clear those things out of your mind and say, okay, these are the things that don't work. These are the things that fail. This is the flawed logic. These are the flawed thoughts or kind of the perversions in the way I'm kind of putting the information together. You got to get rid of that stuff first, which means you have to examine that stuff and re-examine that stuff. You have to think about thinking. You have to make sure that your foundation makes sense, right? Luck is not a strategy. Luck does not equal skill either. Okay. I don't think that somebody that mined Bitcoin because they were like, cool, man, it's better than a video game in 2011, like my brother did, that doesn't make them a genius. I mined 2,000 Bitcoin, so I'm smart. No, you're no different than Mark Cuban, a rich dummy, well-intentioned, but dumb. All right, let me continue. Take, for example, the labor theory of value. This comes up a lot. The labor theory of value. I hear people, now this is on the other side. I hear people using this labor theory of value as a support mechanism for Bitcoin. So we'll go into it. And this is going to get a little bit abstract, but well, you can hit the rewind button, can't you? Or it's just not a rewind button, whatever. Anyway, take, for example, the labor theory of value. Classical economics, by which we mean the body of economic thought, which was in vogue from the time of Adam Smith, right? In Adam Smith's Invisible Hand in the 1770s until the marginalist subjective schools arose in the 1870s, about 100 years later, was confounded by the problem of value. It proposed a cause and effect relationship between human labor and value. Abstract human labor, which itself was an abstract concept derived more from mechanics than from human experience, was produced by laborers on their jobs. This abstract human labor was in some way embodied in the products of that labor, right? A bunch of people do a bunch of stuff and there we go, the widgets come out. And this is the source of all value, they say. And this is the crux of the labor theory of value, okay? Certain inescapable problems arose under this presupposition. Why did selling prices fail to correspond to the total payments made to the labor? How did the phenomenon of profit appear, right? Where's the excess? If this is a system that's A plus B equals C, where does D come from? Where does extra money, dividends, profit, where does the excess come from, right? What was the origin of interest, right? And on a more concrete level, why did an uncut diamond bring a higher price on the market than an intricate mechanism like a clock or a watch, right? A rock from the ground that they just thumbed up and said, hey, look what I got, is worth more, again, than a watch with the underlying presuppositions of the labor theory of value, right? And again, it's that abstract human labor is in some way embodied in the products of that labor and that this is the source of all value, okay? So they could explain the disparity of selling prices of jewels and selling prices of clocks in terms of supply and demand, but their labor theory of value never fit into this explanation. It was an extraneous issue. So they used this theory of supply and demand, which essentially decimated the whole labor theory of value, to explain the labor theory of value, which that's not how it is supposed to go. So now we'll talk a little bit about Karl Marx. Karl Marx was the last major economist to hold, to really believe in the labor theory. In this sense, he was the last of the great classical economists. He wanted to demonstrate that capitalism, by its own internal contradictions, was doomed to a final destruction. Unfortunately for Marx's predictions, what he regarded as a basic set of contradictions of capitalism was merely a set of contradictions in the reasoning of the classical economists. He confused a faulty explanation of the capitalist process with the actual operation of the capitalist system, right? And there's, again, that inability to look at the data and explain the data. So you misinterpret the data or you misinterpret the way the machine works. And that actually is where the flaw in the machine would be, in that if you just turned on the machine and watched it work, it would work. But your explanation has problems in it. Does that make sense? So he confused a faulty explanation of capitalism with the actual operation of capitalism. Ironically, Marx fell into a pit which he always reserved kind of for his enemies. He looked not at the empirical data as such, but at an interpretation of the data. So not at the substructure of the society, but the ideological superstructure. Das Kapital was published in 1867, and by 1871, so just 4 years later, the marginalist assault had been launched by Karl Menger of Austria and W.S. Jevons of England. The labor theory of value, which had kind of undergirdled Marx's whole analysis of capitalism, had pretty much been nuked, right? It was destroyed in that whole period. When Baum-Bauerk, the Australian economist who was to gain fame as Menger's most rigorous disciple, he offered criticisms of Marx in 1884, then again in 1896, so basically they were just, shots fired. Of course, things happened a lot slower back then, right? Like people would go to the printing presses and be like, this is, Marx is getting attacked by bomb. It's like, okay. But anyway, this whole thing would probably take place on Twitter in like 14 minutes these days. But back then, it was 12 years. Anyway, it was clear to the non-Marxists anyway that the Marxian framework had gone down with the classical ship, right? And again, that's looking at a flawed description of capitalism. And again, I'm not arguing capitalism. I'm just saying, insert anything. Looking at a flawed description of crypto versus the actual functioning of crypto would have you down the wrong path, right? So what this new theory did was to reverse the cause and effect relationship of the classical school. The value of labor is derivative. It stems from the value of labor's product, like the result of the labor. This in turn is the outcome of supply and demand. People tend to desire certain products. These products are not in unlimited supply in relation to the demand. Or to put it another way, at zero price, some of that demand is left unsatiated. The value of the product is not derived from labor. The reverse is true. Thus, value is not something intrinsic to either the labor or the product of that labor. Value is imputed by acting men, women, and pronouns undisclosed, right? People have to behave in a certain way to ascribe value. Value is not a metaphysically existent substance. It's not like, well, there's air, there's water, there's value. You can just capture it. No. An object is simply valued, right? Passive, by someone who actively values it. If you like it, it doesn't matter if I like it. You're willing to pay for it. It now has value. Someone can sell it to you. You can buy it, whatever, right? Marx always chided capitalist thinkers for making a fetishism, kind of way with words, a fetishism of commodities, i.e. ascribing to economic goods a life of their own, apart from the human and social relations that make possible the creation of the goods. So this is precisely his version of the labor theory of value. It hypothesized the existence of congealed labor time. It's kind of quasi-metaphysical science. These guys were out there. Anyway, he believed in this idea of congealed labor time, which supposedly gives value to commodities. He had turned to the individuals who actively participate in all economic action. And he would have, if he had just looked at the participants in an economic system, in not the theory, but actually looked at the system, looked at the capitalist system in motion, looked at the socialist system in motion, he would have been led to abandon his own brand of commodity fetishism. Marx, the self-proclaimed empiricist, was befuddled by his own kind of a priori theory. And again, it comes back to this. People, if they have a misinterpretation of a thing and they're arguing the misinterpretation, they can correctly argue the misinterpretation, but they are wrong to begin with. You find yourself discussing things with people and they don't get it, and they argue vehemently against the thing which they don't get. Even if their argument makes sense based on that flawed trajectory, it's still a flawed argument. So it's almost like you have to hit the reset switch on knowledge. You end up teaching. This is why in the crypto space, I don't talk about crypto with people because a lot of times it requires you to go and help them unlearn everything they know about finance because they don't know anything about finance. They know what they learned in school, which is probably not accurate. And then you get into the real world, and if anybody here is an entrepreneur knows this, the world gets real nasty real quick. And you go, but that's not the way the book and my professor. Yeah, your professor went to school when there was black and white television. He's never left the college for a reason. He can't make it in the real world. So, anyway, I digress. Contemporary errors. Yet we should not be too hasty in ridiculing Marx for his insistence on viewing value as something intrinsic in an economic good. People are so used to thinking in these terms that few of us are free from some variety of this basic error. Homes are seen as containing something called equity, which that's tricky, but we'll get into that. But factories possess investments, almost as if these investments were held in some kind of suspension within the factory walls. Marx, the Marxist, of course, had a vested interest in this line of reasoning. The master taught it. Why others continue to indulge in such speculation, though, is kind of perplexing, and it's a problem. It's a case where common sense economics of the man on the street is in error. This is what the Fed does. The Fed looks at their charts and their very limited data sets, understanding they don't do money. They look at a very few things with very few levers. And they say, well, we're not wrong. It's that people are behaving wrong and markets are behaving wrong. Like, wait a minute. You have the data, but it's the people and the markets that are wrong. Your numbers are right. Yes. Okay. The Fed likes to believe they're the center of the universe. Where did that ever go wrong? That idea that you're at the center of everything and everything revolves around you. Conservatives, as it turns out, do not like communism. As a result, they're willing to reject the familiar tenets of Marx's kind of economic system, his economic explanations. Those who have read at least excerpts of Capital, and who are aware of the labor theory of value are usually willing to abandon this idea. So they hear the labor theory of value and they go, well, kind of ridiculous, and not at all. It doesn't, there's no congealed labor. Okay. And there's, funny enough, I still hear this being put forward as an argument, both for and against, especially if it comes up in Bitcoin kind of centric circles, that the value is this bottled up human time, this kind of bottled up goo that equals people's labor output, which is pretty dumb. Isn't it like, well, wait a minute, what if you're stronger than him? What if he goes to the gym more? Should he get paid more? Because he's, no, you're missing it. Yeah, we're missing it. Anyway, and so those who have read at least excerpts of Capital are aware of the labor theory of value. They're usually willing to abandon it. Unfortunately, it would seem that they abandon it in name only simply because Marx happened to believe it. So a lot of times you look at what Marx did and you go, well, that guy's nasty. He, communism, socialism, all this. So everything he said was stupid. No, he wasn't stupid. He was about 80% the way there, but that last 20%, it turns out, is quite important. So they have not abandoned the fundamental approach. This is a lot of people. They haven't abandoned the fundamental approach to economics which Marx employed, namely the fallacy of intrinsic value. And this is the crux of this whole essay, is the fallacy of the intrinsic value, that you can somehow melt something down and that's the value. Now, we try to get a value estimation. We try to melt things down because we want to simplify our thinking as much as we can. That's why we have the 5 T's. That's why we look at whatever data we have on price. We try to look at the future and we try to imagine we're at the beauty pageant, right? Like which girl is going to win, which guy is going to win, or pronoun, whatever. Who's going to win the beauty pageant, not who's the prettiest. Well, these are all ways for us to find enough of a value discussion so that we can invest in it, and we hope that we buy it at X and we sell it or borrow against it at X plus Y, right? And hopefully Y is not a negative number, unless you work at Celsius. Anyway, the most common application of this erroneous concept, at least in conservative circles, is the idea that gold and silver possess intrinsic value, right? While paper money does not. And he says this error deserves special attention. So there are a number of reasons why conservatives make this mistake. They're guided by the best of intentions usually, right? Like people, even our central bankers, they're not monsters. They're not, well, let me roll that back. Most of them are probably generally decent people. I think there's probably a few monsters in the bunch, but most of them are not Nancy Pelosi, right? So they see that paper money and bank credit have led to the past and are creating, well, this is tricky too, because a lot of bankers don't see that that's the problem. But I think a reasonable jurist, a reasonable person that sits back and kind of looks at the whole system would concede that paper money and bank credit have led in the past, historically, and maybe leading today to these virulent inflations, right? They kind of say, well, if it wasn't for credit, if it wasn't for, these banks and their behavior, and it wasn't for paper money. So they fear economic and social dislocations associated with inflation. They may also see that the modern socialist and interventionist states, where they go in and nip and tuck and buy bridges and do all these kind of things and give money to the homeless and all, actually like feed people and give people access to healthcare, stuff like that. Those crazy notions. They see that those states have used inflationary deficit spending policies to increase their power at the expense of private voluntary associations. Some of the more sophisticated observers, right, so people that really sit back and think, may even have understood the link between inflationary policies and depressions, booms and busts. And they may have concluded, quite correctly, that these cycles are not endemic to capitalism as such, but only to economic systems that permit policies of inflation, right? So it's not that you have paper money that ruins the system. It's humans in the machine flipping the buttons, right? Expansionary currencies aren't bad. It's the way they're implemented. All currencies fail. Yes, because all currencies are run by who? Groups. Those groups are typically fat, rich white guys. Is it any surprise that greed has not abated? This is me, by the way. He didn't talk about greed in this essay, although maybe he should have. Anyway, they associate inflation with policies of the state or the state licensed monopolies, fractional reserve banks, rather than the voluntary market economy. Plus, there's a lot of people on the other side of this inflation that do quite well. It's not just like four dudes, right? Nevertheless, they persist in defending the use of specie metals as the only currency, and got to be careful here with the way currency and money is thrown around. So they persist in defending the use of specie metals as the only currency, along with fully redeemable paper IOUs to species metal. So like the metal itself or a claim against the metal, in terms of the intrinsic value of metals. There we get back to this whole thing about intrinsic value, and we know that this is all about intrinsic value, being able to look at a thing with your discounted cash flow model or some system and just going, it's worth this, it's worth 4, and I'm buying it for 2. I'm going to be rich. So, right, I'll just get tons of leverage and everything will be fine. So let's talk for a second value in terms of historic versus intrinsic. So there is a basic confusion here. The confusion rests upon mixing up two very different propositions. Gold and silver are historically valuable. This is true. You can look out and you can do the math and you can see the price history of these assets and you can see that they are historically valuable. Cool. All right. Gold and silver have, the second side of that is, and because of that, gold and silver have intrinsic value. Historical value does not equal intrinsic value. Okay, but most people conflate those. The first proposition is indisputably correct, right? Gold and silver, valuable. Cost, valuable. Price, valuable. In fact, there are a few economists and historical statements that could be said to be even more absolute about this kind of the history of precious metals. Anyway, Professor Mises has built this whole theory of money on the fact that gold and silver, especially gold, were first valued because of properties other than the monetary function, right? It was their brilliance, right? How shiny they were, their malleability, their social prestige, so on and so forth. It was precisely because people valued these metals so highly that they were to become instruments of trade, i.e. money, right? And what is money? Well, at this point, It is anything that extinguishes value and that you have the assumption that it will continue to extinguish value, right? Some kind of continuity. We're going to get into continuity in a minute. Anyway, since these are readily marketable, more so than other goods, they can become money. My personal feelings on this is that anything that extinguishes debt is money at the time in which it extinguishes debt. And you might accumulate that, whatever it is, widgets, driftwood, crazy looking metals, because you think there will be some continuity and it will continue to extinguish debt in the future, right? Offset some debt. All right. Today we value silver and gold for many reasons. And on its first glance, monetary purposes are not the main ones for most people, right? Some people probably just collect coins because they're like, I'm going to fight inflation. You get my gold out of my cold dead hand, right? Okay, cool. I get it. But most people, well, gold, it tends to be more jewelry. Silver has a lot of industrial purposes, so it's a little bit different. But gold specifically, gold is all about the bling, right? And a very tiny amount about the investment, right? Against some kind of weird hyperinflation, all that. So this is because so few populations are legally permitted to use gold in trade. And the statist policies of inflation have brought Grisham's famous law into operation. Silver coins have gone into hoards, and since the value of the silver content is greater than their face value. So there's a lot of times you see this in coins where there's a numismatic value. If you've ever heard that term and you don't know what it is, it just means that there's a premium on that coin far above the actual stamped value of the coin. This happened in silver. You know, silver during like 2010, when the price of silver went up, you had an ounce of silver that was close to $50, meaning if you had about $1 worth of silver coins, whether it was quarters, the 90% silver quarters, the dimes, the nickels, right? Then you, and there's also the silver dollars, right? That was worth about, you know, between 30, 38 and about $45. So the value, the melt value of those tokens had a value far surpassing the stamped value of the coins, if that makes sense. Anyway, but on the international markets, gold has not yet been dethroned, right? Now, you could say that Bitcoin is starting to chip it away, but gold is still the big dog as far as that kind of store of value, ancillary asset. Have some gold in your portfolio, grandpa, right? Like that thing. Okay. Anyway, governments and central banks don't always trust each other, but they do trust the historic value of gold. They trust the price of gold going back many, many, many years. Now, there's all sorts of arguments that this is starting to break and very clearly break, and that gold doesn't track inflation. But most banks, I think it's fair to say at this point, 2022, that most banks are holding more gold than they are Bitcoin. I think we can all agree on that. So what is historic value? Why this historic value? I don't want to involve myself in a rarefied philosophical debate concerning metaphysics, but I think it is safe to say that gold does have it may possess certain intrinsic qualities, not value, intrinsic qualities. There's a difference, right? It's highly durable. It's somewhat divisible. I mean, if you want to melt it, you can chop it, you can write it. It's divisible-ish. I mean, you compare it to Bitcoin and you start to see why Bitcoin makes more sense, and why some people, I think erroneously, make the argument that Bitcoin is gold 2.0. I don't think so, but again, Bitcoin, durable, yes. Divisible, yep. Transportable, yes. And most of all, it is scarce. Well, the scarcity part is tricky because gold is not actually as scarce as you would like to believe. As a matter of fact, in the universe, it's everywhere. It's like massive comets floating by with tons and tons and tons of gold. Like, I think enough, it doesn't matter. The point is, gold is not at all scarce. It's above ground, kind of scarce, and being strangled by some mining facilities and things like that. But for the sake of this argument and the dialogue, let us contend that that is an interesting intrinsic quality, right, of gold. All right. And money has to be all of these things. So, you know, when people talk about, well, what could money be? Again, I think that definition is changing. It used to be a medium of exchange, a store of value, a unit of account. This is kind of the three kind of flavors, what money needed to be. It needed to be divisible, transportable. It needed to be scarce. And this is why there's a difference between money and currency, right? Money, in my opinion, you have to go even deeper and deeper and deeper. In my opinion, it is just anything which extinguishes debt. Okay, so money must be all of these things to one degree or another. There's trade-offs, right? If it is to function as a means of exchange, it has to have some degree of scarcity, some degree of transportability, some degree of divisibility. That's what he's saying. Okay. It is vital that we get our categories straight in our minds. It is not value that is intrinsic to gold, but only the physical properties that are valued by the participants, by acting men. He uses the term acting men. I think he's using that as a proxy for all of us. Anyway, so I'm going to read that again because this is an important contention. It is not the value that is intrinsic to gold, right? But only the physical properties that are valued by the participants in the system that trades gold, right? Gold's physical properties are the product of nature. Its value is the product of acting men. It's the product of participants in an economic system, okay? The case for gold. It would be a terrible mistake, however, to de-emphasize the historic value of gold and silver merely because they possess no intrinsic value. So they can possess no intrinsic value, right? Because that's indeterminable, but they can certainly have historic value, which might make a good case for future ownership if you believe there's continuity in that value, right? The mistake is that this is a mistake that opponents of gold would have us make. They are equally guilty of mixing up the categories of intrinsic value and historic value. Only they argue from the other direction. Conservatives approach the fact of gold's historic value, right? But they mistakenly argue their cases in terms of gold's intrinsic value. So they're arguing that this is gold's intrinsic properties, but these are actually just historical value. Gold has been, like when I say Bitcoin, the most appreciating asset in human history, is that intrinsic value? No, that's historic value because we don't know what it'll do. If our timeline was 2022, it would not be so well performing. It would suck. Big green donkey, right? So their opponents do not appreciate the argument from history, but they spend their time refuting the conservatives' erroneous presentation. They assume that because gold has no intrinsic value, which is true, that gold's historic value as a means of exchange is somehow invalidated. No, because saying that something doesn't have intrinsic value doesn't mean that historically it did not have value. We know that gold has had historic value. The Bitcoin question that gets weird is, when do you have history? Is a minute history, a day, a year, a month, 10 years, 13 years? I don't know. I'm not sure that, I don't know what's history. Sure, life happens much faster now. So maybe like a now year is worth like 10 1970s years. And maybe we do have history. Maybe we have like 200 years worth of 1970s history, right, and back. I don't know. That's AI is going to work that out. But anyway, the two positions are diametrically opposed, yet they focus on a common ground which is irrelevant to both positions. The conservatives do not help their case for gold. Okay, so the conservatives do not help their case for gold by an appeal to intrinsic value. And gold's opponents do not refute the case for gold by demonstrating the error of that appeal, because they're both arguing the wrong things. They're both making an intrinsic value argument, which is, again, a flawed argument. Intrinsic value is nonsensical. There is historic value, which is measurable, which you can look at data, and there's the perception of future data, which is a value proposition that each individual has to make, each participant, each of these men of action, each of the economic participants. Anyway, gold's overwhelming acceptance historically by most men in most societies is a lasting testimony to its value as a means of exchange, right? It should not be referred to as a storehouse of value, as it is in so many kind of textbooks. I also don't think that Bitcoin should be considered a store of value. But that gets into a kind of a different argument. So we'll stay a little bit more on point. Anyway, what we should say is that gold is readily marketable, and for that reason, a valuable thing to store, right? If it's fundable, fungible, transportable, divisible, you can protect it to some degree. There's some measure of scarcity. I think that anything that fits that functions as a store of value. Now, the problem is people say, well, it's not a store of value if the value goes down. Well, that's not true. You can store something of value and there may be up years and down years. But if on the aggregate, it tracks inflation, that's, in my opinion, a store of value on the aggregate tracks inflation through any of the mechanisms that fairly describe monetary inflation, debasement, actual printing of currencies, these kind of things. Anyway, that gets off on a substrate argument, which we could probably talk about at another time. What we should say is that gold is readily marketable, and for that reason, a valuable thing to store. The position of gold in history is a self-perpetuating phenomenon. People tend to accept gold because they and others have historically accepted gold. They assume that others will be willing to accept gold in exchange for goods in the future, right? Or extinguish debt. This assumption of continuity is basic to all goods that function as money. So now you're starting to get this idea, what is money? It extinguishes debt, and there's the assumption of continuity, that it will continue to extinguish debt and that it will continue to function as a money. Continuity is therefore a function of both the physical properties of gold, you could say, and Bitcoin, and of men's estimations concerning other men's future valuations. In short, it involves nature, man, economic participants, and time. So let's keep it simple and let's not offend anybody. Nature, man, and time, right? These are the things that are involved in discerning whether this or that is money. In estimating the importance of gold for an economic system's proper functioning, we must take into consideration all three factors: nature, man, and time, keeping each clear in our minds. This is why we need economic analysis, because without it, we wander blindly, right? You have to analyze. It's important to analyze. You just have to be very careful that looking backwards, you can't look back 10 years and just flip that chart forward 10 years and say, that's the way the future looks. It doesn't work that way. You can't even do. Look, the inability to predict weather patterns out past 7 days, more particle interactions, right? Our society is so interwoven with so much information, all of it in real time, so much stuff banging around in real time, like little radioactive particles. There's just, life is a lot, right? Like life is extra. And so you have to be very careful that you don't make assumptions based on some historical pattern, technical analysis, especially when you don't have proper sets of data, or at least sufficient data. And also, there's no set of data that's going to correctly predict an earthquake, right? Because these aren't patterned things. Usually people say, well, we're due. In California, they say that we're due. Earthquakes happen every 69 years. We're due. What? The world isn't a we're due machine. Anyway, ignorance in the short run is seldom profitable. In the long run, it is invariably disastrous. Fallacious argumentation can too easily be turned against one by his enemies. Just as Marx used the fallacious labor theory of value against those classical economists who tried to defend the free market in terms of that theory, so the opponents of gold can use the intrinsic value theory against those who try to defend gold or Bitcoin, like a Bitcoin standard, right, with it. Now, I think neither gold nor Bitcoin nor any hard money suffice in terms of expanding and contracting economies, because the supplies of those assets don't expand and contract other than like in artificial means by like greedy groups of people looking to skin it. But I believe you need expansionary and contractionary capacity in a currency. You need the ability to be elastic, to have a currency that can grow and contract. Problem is, people don't get elected on the contraction side of that. That's a human problem. You inject greed into these markets and you get a lot of really perverse, but usually kind of understandable outcomes, right? Charlie Munger, he's old, but he's very smart. You show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcomes, right? So this is not to say that logic alone will convince men of the validity of a full gold coin standard or a Bitcoin standard. Logic is always a tool used by men of varying presuppositions. And these are in turn the product of pre-theoretical valuations. We should not trust in logic to save the world. But ignorance, my friend, is far worse. It knows neither its presuppositions nor the probable results of its arguments. It lacks consistency, it lacks clarity, and it can be turned against its user by the enemy. Therefore, let the defenders of the gold or the Bitcoin standard or just crypto in general acknowledge the advent of modern subjective economic reasoning. Let us face the fact that if we go back to Baum-Bauer's refutation of Marx's labor theory of value, if that is valid, then all other applications of the fallacy of intrinsic value are equally invalid, right? Intrinsic value arguments are flawed. And when you try to make when someone is coming at you with these intrinsic value arguments, don't participate. You have to go back. What you're really arguing is, are we both even on the same stage right now? Intrinsic value arguments are like bad mathematical arguments. If you have a bad theory, you can still, right? Like you can have a bad formula and you can do the formula and it will produce some outcome, some product, but it's wrong because the formula is wrong. But people are arguing about the product. Like, well, you can't get here because your math is wrong at the very beginning. Intrinsic value arguments are wrong. They're flawed. They don't exist. So don't find yourself getting sucked into that. This is pointless, right? And it's just, it's an exercise in futility. So when you find yourself in those kind of discussions, you have to back off. And you have to say, we need to get on common ground. We need to find some way to communicate. We need to start over. And you need to find a couple of things that you can agree on, and you have to build from there. So I think, especially in the crypto space, the days of explaining crypto to people as far as an investment, those days are over with. You don't need to tell anyone to buy into crypto. You don't need to tell anyone to buy crypto, to buy Bitcoin, to buy Cardano. No, none of it. Zero. Someone's like, should I buy? I don't know, man. Do you understand what digital assets are endeavoring to achieve? Do you understand what these teams are trying to do? You got to go down the rabbit hole, right? If people are not willing to do the work, they don't deserve to win. They don't deserve it. And if people are late to the party, they don't deserve to win. Matter of fact, anybody that watches Formula One, you can't show up an hour late to the race and be like, I got to make up lost time, man. I'm late to the race. You lose, man. Now you might eventually get good enough to go compete in another race. But in this first race, you missed it. People that missed the beginning of the digital asset space, they missed it. Those early days are gone. But there are many, I still think we're early. There's many more early days, right? We don't have a fully, listen, anytime a 650 Bitcoin sale on Coinbase Pro can tank a market 7% in 2 hours, we are not there yet. We are super early. There's no real regulation, nothing thoughtful, right? Stable coins are unstable. They're mostly junk. Like if you look around at this space, you're early. And even if you just got here today, you're not just early, you're lucky because you haven't endured the last 3, 4, 5, 7, 8 years of ups and hard downs and ups and hard downs. You haven't gotten your stomach, poured turpentine on it 45 times. Do you know that the gains in the crypto space, the major gains, like in Bitcoin specifically, they occur during an 11-day, like 11 total days per year? If you're trading these assets, you think you're so good that you know the 11 days out of 365 where things are going to go your way? Real quick, just do some mental inventory. If you believe you're so good at trading that you're going to catch those 11 days, well, you may need to look in the mirror and say, that guy might have some flawed logic. If you want to trade the crypto space, go and trade it once it's fully formed. You can't trade it right now because it doesn't exist right now. And this is why I say there's not bear and bull markets. It's not a market. We don't have a market. So not only do intrinsic value arguments don't exist, but it's pretty difficult to find any value for these assets. You have to be very forward looking, right? So I'll conclude the very last of his essay, which is a great one, by the way. I urge you to read it. I'll put a link to this. If we cannot learn to think consistently on this point, then we will be grist for the inflationist mill. The inflationist juggernaut may resemble a charging elephant in our era. It may be too late to stop it with a small caliber rifle, but we know it cannot be stopped with a pop gun. So, it is important because you've got to square these things away in your own mind. And even if you're not getting into discussions with people about digital assets, things like that, you want to square it away in your own mind. If you're looking at these assets and you find yourself having trouble coming up with a conclusion, if you find yourself having trouble valuing these things, and you say, I can't get a clear price, I can't get a clear value, I can't make it make sense to me, then back off a little bit, get a little space, and start writing down the things that you do feel you're confident about, that you have conviction. And then decide, invest with your level of conviction. I think that's pretty important. And when you discuss this stuff with other people, if you should find yourself in one of these discussions where people are using flawed logic, or they're trying to use a discounted cash flow model to tell you what Bitcoin is or isn't worth, and I can't value it, there's no value, those arguments. Don't get into a discussion with those people. Just say there's no value for you. For me, it has value because I'm willing to purchase it, because I think in the future, I think there will be continuity and an increase in its value, and it will have the ability, or borrowing against it will have the ability to extinguish debt, both now and in the future, and at a greater rate than now, or whatever way you want to word it. Anyway, have a good Monday. I'll be banging around in the chat, but have a good Monday. Stay out of trouble. If you think this is something that would help people, throw it on the Twitter. Tweet it. Share it to the Twitter. And maybe some other people can take some little bits, little pieces. I urge you to read this. It's a cool, really cool essay, and it may have you think about different things. There might be parts of it that you really want to kind of hone down on. He uses gold. I threw Bitcoin in there, but I think it's pretty relevant. And he's saying this is 1969, and it is probably more relevant now. It's certainly as relevant as it was. Anyway, on that note, stay in school. Don't do drugs. Don't do anything my poor, insolvent, drunk, strung out on meth grandmother wouldn't do. As you know, that is very little. We will see you tomorrow on Money Morning Live with American Institute of Crypto Investors, and then back on Wednesday. So I give you, I wish you a pew-pew, and a pew-pew.